Even before the worst of the drought, we knew we were in a duck depression. I visited my favorite fowling waters, and I found nothing but empty skies. All that was left of the great flights were my memories. I knew then that we had to do something, and do it soon.
The banks of a trout stream may seem like a strange place for the birth of an organization devoted to waterfowl, but that is where Ducks Unlimited was born. At the lodge were John C. Huntington, son of a St. Louis attorney, who as early as 1912 had begun promoting restoration of game birds. Arthur M. Bartley, a man who liked to get his hands dirty and his feet wet. Ray E. Benson, an experienced shotgunner who would later edit the first Ducks Unlimited magazine. And at the head of the table was Joseph Palmer Knapp. They had already formed and funded an organization which had laid out a 10-year plan of action for increasing the number of upland game birds. But now they were about to do something incredibly bold, something that had never been done before. Create an organization that would manage habitat on a massive scale to impact species that spanned an entire continent. What started at that club with those men on that day would remain the key elements that define DU to this day: volunteerism, partnerships, science-based decision-making, and a sound business model.
It is not what man does, but what he does not do for migratory waterfowl, which is chiefly responsible for diminishing numbers. What is urgently needed is a program which will take no account of international boundaries, but will bring neighbor nations of the North American continent into harmonious accord for the good of the game. Most hunters spend countless hours and dollars on ways to bring more ducks to their blind, but we were talking about a need to manage waterfowl over the entire continent. And it had become clear that Mother Nature needed a helping hand.
Faced with the prospect of shortened or closed duck seasons, Knapp and the others had decided that immediate action was required. But first, they would have to gain a fuller understanding of the causes of the duck decline. To do so, they undertook what has been called the granddaddy of all wildlife surveys, the 1935 International Wild Duck Census. The survey area was to cover over 750,000 square miles in Canada and an additional 230,000 square miles in the United States, in an area that is sparsely settled and poorly roaded. When the survey was completed, more game birds issued their findings. They reported that in the area surveyed, they believed there were 42.7 million ducks, with an estimated 65 million birds for the entire continent. This survey became the template for how seasons and bag limits are established even today. But most important, the census also dramatically reinforced what the founders of DU had suspected all along. The focus of North American waterfowlers must begin in the prairies of Canada.
You know, the first pioneers wrote the folks back home that out here the flocks of ducks and geese were so big that, they darkened the sun. And maybe they were, for a while. But you know, soon North America started filling up with people. And in the first part of this century, they started moving west into the Canadian prairies. Well, for a while, nobody paid too much attention to this situation until the 30s. And then a survey was made, and it proved that the ducks were declining. Yes, they were declining very rapidly indeed. And the reason was that the breeding marshes in Canada were drying up. Well, of course, periodic drought was partly responsible, but really, more and more land was being drained for agricultural purposes. Well, this worried a lot of folks. Soon these worried folks got together and they organized Ducks Unlimited. And since that time, this international conservation organization has been spending millions, in the prairie provinces and all the way across Canada in sort of a colossal home improvement program for ducks and for geese.
You cannot grow ducks without grass and water. And you cannot do the work of restoring that water without money. Success that first year would be determined in two ways. Ducks Unlimited would have to find the best man they could find in the fledgling field of conservation. And secondly, they would set a lofty goal. In its first year, DU would seek to restore 100,000 acres. The man they decided would be charged with the task of restoring these 100,000 acres was Thomas Maine. Tom Maine was borrowed from the Canadian National Railways, where he was the chief surface water engineer. He was an avid hunter and an avid conservationist. Maine was marked on the outside most notably by his snow-white head of hair and an injured eye that was rumored to have been caused by a falling mallard. The first staff meeting of DU Canada was held in Winnipeg on Wednesday, April 20th, 1938. The group had discovered 3 sites to begin their conservation work: Waterhen Marsh near Kinestino in Saskatchewan, Many Island Lake northeast of Medicine Hat, Alberta, and Big Grass Marsh near Langruth, Manitoba. Big Lake would come to be known as Big Grass Marsh, which in turn would come to be known as Duck Factory No. 1.
The interesting group that has chosen the arresting name of Ducks Unlimited fits into the Western scene as something more than an organization interested in sport. It is interested in maintaining water supplies, of creating and maintaining inland bodies of water where ducks may breed, of attracting more birds, of working with the farmer to create better bodies of moisture. All this is linked up with better agricultural development in Western Canada. In an indirect way, the farmer is as much interested in water for ducks as anyone else.
Ducks Unlimited. What a wonderful name for a group of sportsmen whose object it is to perpetuate our splendid game birds and their natural breeding places. And the good news is that they are getting busy.
We know that we're winning the battle, Ed, and we know that in order to go on winning it, we must go on fighting and building, protecting this heritage for our children and their children after them. It's up to us.
I know it is, Bob, and I'm proud of the work Ducks Unlimited has done and will continue to do.
At the end of its first year and really only 8 months of field operations, the founding fathers of Ducks Unlimited knew it had something on its hands. DU had forged solid partnerships with wildlife agencies in the Canadian provinces, with local landowners and farmers, and with hunters across North America. Wells were filling again with water, and the skies were filling again with birds. By the end of 1938, DU would meet its ambitious goal of restoring 100,000 acres of habitat, with a final tally in its very first year of 155,000 acres.